Proper Brewing Company. Leah, my wonderful, beautiful, gorgeous wife, is going to be following me around. And so you are going to get to see the actual facility. And so if there's something that you see and you just have to know what it is, please ask a question too, because there's a lot of equipment, a lot of stuff. And it's not always immediately evident what it does. I don't even know what some of it does. Okay, so Right Proper. We opened in 2013 as a brew pub in the historic Shaw neighborhood of Washington, D.C., right next to the Howard Theater at 7th and T Streets Northwest. So in 2011, my wife and I were in the restaurant industry. We had been in the restaurant industry forever. And we were in the restaurant industry for so long because it was always our dream to own our own brew pub. Brew pub is really the combination of a brewery and restaurant. So it's a restaurant business model, but there's a brewery inserted into the middle of it. And the reason why we wanted to own our own brew pub, especially in Washington, D.C., is because Washington, D.C. really didn't have anything like that. I mean, you go out west, you go to pretty much anywhere in Colorado, and every town that has over 1,000 people has its own little neighborhood brew pub, where it's just this inexpensive, good restaurant that has great beer, and you can pop in, get a fresh beer and a burger for $20, less than that, And, Leah and I, we were, just like everyone else our age, we were, always at work, running around like crazy. And we didn't really plan meals for the week the way that our parents did. And so we would end up eating out a lot. And as a result, we would end up spending a lot of money on food because restaurants in DC were really expensive. The majority of them were. And so we really wanted to, we were in love with beer. I was absolutely in love with beer. Leah was a professional sommelier at the time. And so we really had this concept of creating this, really well done, but affordable and approachable restaurant with really top quality beer. So I quit my job in 2011, and Leah worked and kept the lights on. And while I wrote the business plan and started fundraising, and then finally we got the business open in December of 2013. And so that's a brew pub. Restaurant and brewery combined right next to the Howard Theater, and then it was an immediate success. We were very fortunate, great location, and we had a really great team, very talented team on our side. And so within 2 years, we, actually within the first year, we started planning for our production brewery, and a lot of that was because in the first year, we really maxed out the brewing capabilities at that pub. So, and we started to hear more outside demand for our beers. And so we decided to, really go for it and open a larger production facility. And the production brewery, which is where we are standing now, is in Brookland in Northeast DC. And so the production brewery business model is really the brew pub business model turned on its head, where it's a very, very large brewery that focuses on wholesale and distribution. So it's a much lower profit margin, but a much larger volume of beer going out. And then we do have a small tasting room here as well. So we do have a very small area for guest services, where at the brew pub, it's a tiny little brewery and giant guest services area with full service kitchen and 2 giant bars and dining room and everything like that. So we're gonna turn around this way, and then we're just gonna talk a little bit about how beer is made.
Quick question for you. Sorry, we just had a question pop up in the chat for you, and you addressed part of it about the path to owning and operating a brewery, but some folks are wondering what your Georgetown undergrad major was.
I was a history major. So what that means is I learned how to read and write. Not to say I really knew how to read and write going in. Kind of talked my way into Georgetown. What was that?
You did post-bac pre-med. Post-bac pre-med.
Oh yeah, and then I did go after I graduated in '01. I kind of bopped around for a couple years. Had no idea what I wanted to do for myself or as a living, and then I went back to Georgetown to do a 2-year post-bac pre-med program, and that's when I really fell in love with beer and really decided that I wanted that to be my profession and not go into medicine. And truthfully, I would have been a terrible doctor. Just probably would have killed a lot of people. So I think we're all benefiting here. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question, and then so we're going to have to go through a few people to get answers. I'm going to ask you a question. Does anyone know the difference between distillation and fermentation? I'll wait, see if anyone answers. No? Okay.
Nothing yet.
There's no yeast involved in distillation, is there?
Pardon me, what was it?
There's no yeast involved in distillation, is there?
Correct. Correct, person that I cannot see. You are absolutely correct. So, fermentation is the creation of alcohol, the formation of alcohol. Distillation is the condensation of alcohol, like the condensing of alcohol. So, for instance, what's made with distillation? Liquor, whiskey, vodka. That's you distill to make those products. However, you have to start with a base alcohol to get to that final whiskey. Okay, so let's take whiskey as an example. If you're trying to make whiskey, it goes through the distillation process, but what are you distilling? You're distilling a base alcohol. That base alcohol, just like all alcohol, is formed through fermentation. And so if you are making whiskey, that base alcohol that you're starting with is beer. So whiskey is, in essence, distilled, unhopped beer. You have to brew beer first, then you distill it, and then you create whiskey. So fermentation is really the product that you're making is defined, the category of alcohol that you are creating is defined by the source of the sugar that you're fermenting. So, for instance, if you are fermenting sugars that come from grapes, you are making wine. There's no way you can make beer from grapes. If the source of the sugar that you are fermenting is honey, you're making mead. If the source of the sugar you are making is a growing grass, you are making beer. If it is grain, it is beer. So the primary grain that is used in fermentation to make beer is barley. It has a very, very high starch content in the seeds. Those seeds are harvested and allowed to germinate, and then that germination is arrested with heat. Heat of all different, you could dry it in the sun to stop the germination, or you could kiln it at 600 degrees, 1,000 degrees if you wanted to. That temperature variation creates a very large spectrum of malt flavors and characteristics. So a single type of barley can be malted that is dried in a lot of different ways. And the process in which you do that creates the specific type of malt that it is. So in general, the lower the heat, the longer the time of drying, the lighter the malt. And then the higher the heat, the shorter the time, the darker the malt. Now also what comes with that is the darker the malt, the lower the sugar content is going to be in that malt. So what that means is that those high temperatures that you use, that you need to create that dark malt, actually start to denature the sugars, the sugar molecules. And so when there's less sugar, that means there's less food for the yeast to eat, and therefore there's less alcohol that can be produced. So a beer made entirely of dark malt, for instance, these dry Irish stouts, for instance, like Guinness, are relatively low in alcohol because the malts that are used to make them have a low sugar content. And when there's not that much sugar, then there's not too much alcohol that you can make. So it's really interesting that, you know, dark beers that are inherently very dark because of the large amount of dark malt are actually very low in alcohol, relatively low in alcohol. That doesn't mean that you can't make a very, very strong beer, a very, very dark beer, very, very strong, because it really only takes a small percentage of dark malt in the entire malt bill to make a beer completely black. But dry Irish stout, for instance, like Guinness, is pretty low in alcohol because it does use a large proportion of dry roasted malt. This is very easily demonstrated by going down to your local Irish pub and asking them to make a black and tan, which is that, you know, half light lager beer, light colored lager beer, and dark, you know, dry Irish stout, dry stout. And the stout will actually rise to the top. It'll settle on top, and the lager will be on the bottom because it is less dense, has less sugar, has less alcohol. It is the lighter of the two beers. So we use all of our malt. We're a very small brewery, so we don't have like a silo. Maybe one day we will, but all of our malt arrives in these giant, like billion-pound pallets. Each one of these bags is about 55 pounds of malted grain. We use, the primary grain we use is barley. We also use oats, and we use a lot of wheat as well. We have 2 wheat beers that we are very big sellers for us. Each one of our recipes takes anywhere from 600 to 1,200 pounds of grain. The first step is to mill that grain. Back there on top, you'll see a cat toy. And then if you move to the right, you'll actually see the cat up there.
Is she there?
Yeah, here. There she is. That's Prima. She's our brewery cat.
Oh.
She's mean as hell. You can pet her 3 times and then she'll try and bite you. She's our little murder machine. She's our organic pest control. So where am I? Malting grain. So the first step is to mill the grain. So we dump all the bags of grain into the mill, and then hi, sweetie. And then the milled grain then moves through an auger, which is like a flexible corkscrew in this PVC pipe right here. And that then goes up and over the garage door here. Oh, don't trip, honey. And into this piece of stainless steel over here, which is our grist case. And that'll be generally mill all the grain the night before we brew, because it can take up to 2 hours to mill the grain. So it's really long, back-breaking process. The grist case will hold the grain overnight, and then the brewers, they get here, they start brewing about 8 o'clock in the morning. They'll come in and turn on another auger, which moves the grain into this guy, which is our mash tun. So inside here, this whole piece of equipment is essentially 2 pieces of equipment in one. So at the brew pub, it's actually 2. So here, but it's combined into one here. So at the bottom underneath this line is what's called a hot liquor tank. Liquor in the alcohol industry, believe it or not, in the production of alcohol, just means water. So this is a hot liquor tank. It's essentially a giant thermos, double-walled stainless steel. Inside are steam jackets that run all along. And then the bottom half, it holds about 30 barrels of water, over 900 gallons of water at about 140 degrees. So it's really, really, really hot water. And then on the top is essentially a giant soup kettle with a false bottom. It's like a grated bottom, and large mechanical rakes that move around inside. They're brewing tomorrow, and it's already hot, so I'm going to try and conserve as much heat. Usually I would open it up for you, but they're obviously trying to keep this baby warm and make their day a little bit shorter tomorrow. But inside, so we'll pump all the grain in, pump water on top of it, the striped water on top of it from the hot liquor tank, and then we're going to be creating this large slurry, this large soup. And that hot water is going to extract all that wonderful sugar, all the color, all the protein from the grain. That whole process takes about an hour. If you want to know what it smells like, just go to your store and buy grape nuts and pour hot water on grape nuts. It smells exactly the same. The reason is because there's barley in grape nuts. So the rakes are going to be going. This takes about an hour. We're sucking out all the sugar. And then what we do is we essentially just like pull the plug. It's just like a bathtub. We pull the plug and all that hot, sweet, dark liquid drains out of the bottom, and we pump it. It's still an internal process. It has not left our control at any point. If we move it internally over to this guy, which is our kettle. And this, we bring the hot, sweet liquid, which is now called wort, up to a boil. And it's this time that we add hops. And before I get into hops, which is a very important part of the brewing process, important ingredient, I'll talk about what is left in here. So what's left in here was started out as up to 1,200 pounds of dry malted grain is now thousands of pounds of hot, sticky, wet, spent grain that it's a waste product for us now. So we have to get it all out, turn on the rakes, get shovels. And if you guys have seen the show Breaking Bad, they have those big plastic barrels where they hide dead bodies and money. We use the exact same barrels. We get our forklift and pallets, and we bring dead body barrels in here, and we pull all the grain out into the dead body barrels, forklift it out. And if there's ever a reason to open your own brewery, it's you get to own your own forklift, which is right over there. Forklift is by far the most fun thing that you can do in your day, during the day. It's just, it'll lift anything. It's amazing. I would take it home. I would do laundry with it if my wife would allow me to. It's just fantastic. Anyways, so all the grain is now in the dead body barrels. We move it outside. We have a farmer who comes down from Maryland, just above Frederick. He comes down once a week, and he picks up all of those dead body barrels of grain. And he brings them to his farm, and he feeds them to his cows and pigs. It's a wonderful relationship. No money is exchanged because it's a waste product for us, but it's free food for the farmer for his cows and pigs. What's really interesting is that during the summer months when it's hot, there are trace fermentables in the spent grain. And so when it's sitting in the hot sun, especially with a plastic bag over it to keep birds and squirrels out of it, it will actually begin to ferment. And we know that because the plastic kind of balloons up. So by the time it gets to the cows, it has a little bit of alcohol in it. The cows now, according to the farmer, have really enjoy the little shot of booze that they get with the grain, and now they recognize the barrels, and so they actually start chasing the truck down the road.
Thor, would this possibly be an okay time for a few questions? We're getting a couple in the chat.
Sure.
So first off, we have a comment about someone who's a Belgian wit fan and who frankly doesn't understand the trendy IPA category. It seems to be a broad and not very well defined category. Can you explain exactly what an IPA is?
Yeah, it's so an IPA is it's basically a British pale ale or a British bitter, which is a very, very, very old style of beer, which is an ale as opposed to a lager. That all comes with from the yeast that ferments it. It's a certain species of yeast that ferments ales. So British ales, very, very light, low in alcohol, easy to drink, and a very short shelf life. They were trying to figure out how to get those beers from London, so London-based breweries, all the way over to colonial India. So what they did was they started packing those beers with hops, and hops are natural antiseptic, and so the hops were keeping the beer fresher longer, but as a result, they were making the beer pretty bitter. And so a new style really formed called an India Pale Ale, which meant that it was basically a pale ale, but that was going to be a lot more bitter because of all the hops. That style of beer has a wonderful story, as I just summarized very briefly. And so when American craft brewers and home brewers really started to experiment and go outside of that kind of very light lager type of brewing, the German brewing traditions, they really clung onto the IPA because it was so different and so unique to everything else that was being drunk at that time, so the early 80s. Now, right now there's 8,000 breweries in the United States. There were literally 70 breweries in the early 80s, and they were all making the same type of beer, this just kind of light, flavorless lager. And so when craft brewing started and home brewing started, they really latched on to this type of beer that was so different from everything else, which is the IPA, and that really did kind of dominate, and still does today in a lot of ways, dominate the craft beer landscape here in the United States. And now the variations of IPA have just gone on and on and on. That is almost ad nauseum. So we're going to be releasing an IPA into our wholesale market in a few months, and where the name of the beer comes from this, kind of exhaustive, hyper subcategorization of IPA as a style. And so we are only calling it an IPA. We're not calling it a New England IPA or a hazy IPA or a double IPA or a triple IPA or blah, 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 blah. We are just calling it an IPA, and the beer is called Fear No Art, which is just kind of a very subtle reference to asking people to stop trying to categorize, stop trying to ask questions, just enjoy it for what it is. And because you are a Belgian wit fan, that style is very near and dear to our hearts as well. And our brand new beer is Low Wit, which I'll show you our stock. It's this beautiful, beautiful, spicy Belgian style white ale that we're very proud of. So anyways, getting back.
Two more questions.
No, another question. Okay.
Yeah, we have a couple of others in here. First off, in the last year, what's been your most popular brews? And what kind of beer, I think you covered what kind of beer do you plan to brew in the future. So what's your most popular brews?
Most popular beer is a beer called Raised by Wolves, which is an American style pale ale. Really nice, bright, hoppy pale ale. So it's kind of like it drinks like an IPA, but it only has 5% alcohol. And that beer is extremely hard to keep up with production of that beer. It's very popular.
Great.
And,
go ahead.
And then coming down the pipeline, we have Fear No Art, which is a really dry IPA.
And Senate.
And Senate here. Oh my gosh, Senate. So Senate, we have oh man, my wife is going to kill me. I can go on forever about Senate beer. Senate was the most popular beer in Washington, D.C. From the 1890s to the 1950s. It was brewed by the Christian Heinrich Brewery, where the Christian Heinrich Brewery was gigantic. It is where the Kennedy Center is now. That's where the Heinrich Brewery was. It was this massive facility. And Senate beer was really Washington's beer for decades and decades and decades. The brewery finally went out of business, and the beer was defunct and was no longer produced during the 1950s. And so, but the Christian Heinrich Museum is still very, very active in the Washington, D.C. brewing community, and they're really kind of a hub and provide a wonderful historical basis for everything that we do. And so we have actually worked with the Heinrich House to redevelop that brand based on the original recipe of that brand. And it involved the Brewing Science Department at the University of Oregon. It was this huge, massive project, and we finally got it done. And the beer is now going to be part of our core lineup, and we're releasing it November 3rd, Election Day. And it's just a wonderful light corn lager. It's absolutely delicious and endlessly refreshing. We released a test batch of 400 cases this spring, and it's sold like wildfire. So we're very excited to have that. Any other questions?
That is so cool. I'll ask one other quick question, and then we can save a couple for the end. Was your business name inspired by the British Parliament?
Haha. My wife is from a very small town in North Carolina called Shelby. And in Shelby, they have a very particular way of speaking. And one thing that they do is they say things like, you know, I'll be there right quick, or she's just right pretty. And I've always thought of Washington, D.C. as a small southern town. So I thought it was appropriate that we kind of bring some of that kind of southern wit into our branding. So we thought that D.C. could use a Right Proper Brew Pub.
Love it.
So, okay, I will speed this along so my wife's arms don't fall off here. So over here is the kettle behind this fan. And this is where we add hops. We bring the wort up to a boil. And just like any other recipe that you're making, it's always about balance, right? And so the wort is inherently very, very sweet. And so we're going to balance that sweetness with something savory. That savory component is hops. So the main savory component in beer has been hops for a few hundred years. But before that, you know, beer has been brewed for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Some people think it predates bread. So really people were throwing anything and everything in their beer. Hops is it's a wonderful addition. It's a fast growing vine. The closest plant relative to hops is cannabis. And they're very easy to cultivate and very easy to grow. And we use hops from all over the world. Of all the ingredients that go into beer, hops is the only one that has any sense of terroir. So if there's any wine drinkers, you know, the sense of terroir where the ground where the grapes are grown has an effect on the finished wine, has an effect on the flavor and aroma of the finished wine. Hops is the same way. It's very easily demonstrated in hops that come from New Zealand. If you guys have ever had a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, you know it's very citrusy. The same goes for hops that are grown in New Zealand. They're actually very citrusy as well. It's very cool. So the boiling process takes about an hour. We're adding hops into the kettle. And then we have to cool the wort down very, very quickly because it's near boiling temperature at this point. And we need to bring it down to about 70 degrees, which is the optimal temperature that the yeast will start to work. So once we add yeast to the wort and it starts fermenting, so that means we're adding the little microorganisms into the wort and starts eating the sugar, and its byproduct is alcohol and CO2. But just like any other living organism, it doesn't like to be too hot or too cold. It really likes to be at 70 degrees, just like us, just like humans. And so we have to cool it from roughly 180 to 190 degrees down to 70 degrees very quickly. And so we do that by moving this piece of equipment right here, which is a heat exchanger. It looks like a radiator. It is essentially a radiator, but instead of getting very, very hot, it gets very, very cold. Think of it as a 2-lane highway. In one direction is going super cooled water. So that's a water and glycol mixture brings the temperature of the water down to about 25 degrees Fahrenheit. That is extremely, extremely cold. It's below freezing temperature. So the glycol lowers the freezing temperature of the liquid water, so it can go down below freezing. And in the other direction is going boiling hot, soon to be beer. And as they pass by each other, there's an exchange of heat, and it cools it down to about 70 degrees pretty quickly. I'm going to grab soda, and then we can move into what's called the cellar, which is where we actually do our fermentation. So this is where Right Proper Brewing Company is a bit more unique than the vast majority of other breweries operating in the world. We have two distinct fermentation programs here. One, we're using traditional brewer's yeast. These are yeast that were really developed from Louis Pasteur's work, where he isolated specific yeast strains that ferment specific sugars that come from barley. So these are really brewer's yeast strains. There's hundreds of them now. But they all come from the same family, and they're very easy to control. They're very easy to predict, and a lot of the equipment in a modern brewery is designed around keeping these yeast from this family happy and healthy. We also, and that's everything over here with blue hoses. That means beers that we ferment with these yeast strains, we could pretty much take to any brewery in the world and make an almost carbon copy of that beer and not worry about affecting that other brewery in any sort of way. Those breweries are set up to do exactly that. On the other hand, on this side of the brewery, we're using a completely different type of fermentation. We're using non-traditional yeast strains and even bacteria. So we're using yeast strains that come from a family called Brettanomyces. Brettanomyces are very large single-cell microorganisms. They are extremely resilient, and they're almost impossible to kill. And so most breweries do not want these yeast strains anywhere near their equipment, because they will infect their equipment and affect the flavor of the finished beer. We like them very much because if they're used in the correct way, they can create absolutely wonderful, wonderful beers. And since we love them so much, we like to keep them as happy as possible. And these yeasts are really happiest in wood. These are French oak foeders, so they're oak fermentation tanks. The yeast that I was talking to, the Brettanomyces, they're alive in the nooks and crannies of the individual staves of wood. And they are now reliant on a regular influx of beer for their life cycle. So essentially, these two tanks are two little micro ecosystems. So the beers that we produce in these tanks can only be produced here, whereas the beer that we produce in tanks over here, we can produce anywhere in the world. And so we absolutely adore yeast. Really, the entire beer making process, yeast is the most important, has the most effect on the final, obviously, alcohol content, but flavor and aroma of the beer. You can brew a batch of beer, separate it into two different fermentation tanks, pitch two different yeast strains, and you're getting drastically different products. And so with that knowledge, the last thing we want to do is harm our wonderful yeast strains. And so none of our beers are filtered or pasteurized. However, we don't want a murky beer because the act of fermentation takes a small amount of yeast and creates a tremendous amount of yeast. And so the beer after it's fermented is very, very hazy. Since we don't want that, we want to brighten up the beer. The way we do that is we essentially cool it down very quickly. So we move all of our beers into tanks just like this. This is what's called a bright tank. It's essentially a giant, very, very, very cold thermos where it's double-walled stainless steel wrapped with glycol. And we move the beer in here and we bring the temperature of the beer down very, very low. And what that does is it promotes attenuation and flocculation of all the dead yeast, all the hot particulates and proteins and things like that, and sinks to the bottom, and we can pull off nice bright beer. But none of the yeast is filtered out or pasteurized. We keg and can all of our keg, bottle, and can all of our beers here. It's all done by hand.
No.
We did just purchase a brand new canning line, which is much more efficient than the canning line that we have been using in the past. And so this is going to allow us to distribute our core beers more effectively. Obviously, it's an extremely complicated piece of machinery. It can fill 4 cans of beer at a time, and I think when it's really cranking, we can get up to 60 cans a minute. So it's and then the whole beer making process is actually very energy intensive. By rule of thumb, it takes about 5 glasses of warm water to make 1 glass of cold beer. And so we are a burden on in terms of energy consumption. And so with us being in our mission statement, a responsible company wanting to make responsible decisions, we have decided we wanted to reduce that energy impact as much as possible. And so our entire roof and we have a big awning out front are entirely covered with solar panels. We last year we produced 54,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, which is about 60% of our energy consumption came from the sun. And so that's something that we're very proud of. It really makes us feel a lot better about the amount of energy that we consume in the beer making process. And then I'm going to show you the finished product and where the beer is stored. And then you guys can ask some questions, and maybe I'll take the phone from my wife so her arm doesn't fall off. So this is all of our finished product. This is by the end of the week, it will be all the way up to the ceiling and about probably another row out, and then it'll all empty out again. The vast majority of our beer is distributed in Washington, D.C., and we're also distributed in Northern Virginia as well. In Montgomery County. And so this is the beer that we inventory, and this is the beer that we pay taxes on. And this is where I like to make a little push in terms of taxes. So we pay, in the past, we have been required to pay up to $7 per barrel of beer that we produce. Let me show you how much a barrel of beer. This is a half barrel of beer. This is 15.5 gallons. So for every 2 of these we produce, we used to have to spend $7 to the federal government. In the past couple of years, that number has been cut in half, due in large part to the work of the Brewers Association, which is the lobbying arm of the craft beer industry, which my wife, who is holding the camera, is actually a member of the board of directors. And so the board of directors has been absolutely instrumental in getting that tax burden cut in half. The reason is that although we do produce alcohol just like everyone else, the vast majority of craft brewers in the United States are small, independently owned businesses. And so that means that they do not have the ability to support a tax burden the same way that a large multinational company like Anheuser-Busch, Miller Coors can. And so the argument that the Brewers Association made is that every dollar that is saved by these small independently owned businesses goes directly back into the economy. It buys new equipment, it hires new employees. And so we have been able to save thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars because of this tax break. However, this tax break is, and we are in jeopardy of losing this tax break. Now, Unfortunately, because I live in Washington, D.C., I do not have a vote in Congress because of the geographic location of where I live. I do not have the ability to ask a state representative to fight for my business. So that is another issue that I'd like to bring up at some point. The issue of DC statehood, I think, is an absolute crime that there's 700,000 U.S. citizens that do not have a vote in Congress. It's taxation without representation, and in my opinion, that's why we fought the Revolutionary War. But if you do not live in Washington, D.C., and you do want to support small, independently owned businesses, please do call your state local representative and let them know that you support lower taxes for small breweries, because that money is not going into some Wall Street investor's pocket. It is going directly back into the business. It's hiring new employees, it's buying equipment, it's adding to the local economy. So that's my pitch. Thank you so much. I am now going to reach over and take this from my beautiful wife, and I'm going to turn it around. Oh, wait, hold on. Haha, there we are. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys may have.
Great, Thor. We have a couple in the chat that I'll go through, and then of course, anyone else, feel free to hop in. We had a question about if you had any plans for a gluten-free brew, or would that kind of endeavor require a completely separate circuit of equipment?
Yes, the second one. So we are very, very small. Our goal for this year pre-COVID was about 5,000 barrels. Just to give you a sense, Dogfish Head, which is another small independently owned brewery, they're at 600,000 barrels of beer. So we do 5,000, they do 600,000. So we, in terms of resources and equipment, we really cannot, we don't have the ability to get into things like gluten-free. Another big thing people have been asking for is alcohol-free beers. Something that I think is really, there are more and more people that are enjoying life without alcohol these days. And so the demand for that is going up, but unfortunately we don't have the capacity.
And then another person was asking, I know you mentioned resellers, and you may have just addressed this recently, but is your beer available on the West Coast?
It is not. No, we are distributed in DC, Northern Virginia, and Montgomery County, Maryland. We were recently, and we were in the whole state of Maryland and New York, but as the demand for our beers kept growing in our home market, we decided to pull out of those markets so we could conserve resources.
Got it. And then I know that this is like asking who your favorite child is, but which is your personal favorite brew of those that you produce?
Low Wit. It's Belgian style white ale, clean, spicy, just absolutely delicious. I'll get a can for you. It's going to get a little loud in the cooler here. So this is Low Wit.
Love it. A comment here from a native Washingtonian agreeing with you on DC statehood.
Yes.
Asking about distribution to New York City, which I know you just covered. And then again, someone just hopped in. Apologies if this was asked and answered already, but do you have any plans of making hard seltzer? I'm assuming.
Hard seltzer. No, but our good friends at DC Brow, they make absolutely delicious hard seltzer called, oh my gosh, what is it called? Full Transparency is what they call it. But it's awesome. So definitely, we don't make it, but definitely check them out.
Fantastic. I think that is most of the questions in the chat currently. Anyone else has questions, you can also unmute yourself if you'd like and ask them.
Yeah, and then I'll give you my email. It's Thor, Thor, at rightproperbrewing.com. feel free to send me an email if you have a question, or if you guys want to come out and visit us anytime. We're here.
We did get a question. I'm not sure that got a question about whether or not you can ship beer out of state.
Yeah, we can. It depends on the state. Each state has its own laws. So depending on the state, we could. It is pretty expensive to do that, but you know, for Georgetown alum, we'd be happy to get that done for you.
And then we also had someone just ask, who unfortunately had to join late, how many different types of beer do you brew at the brewery?
So at the Brew Pub, which is the restaurant, we produce in a normal year about 80 different recipes. And that's anywhere between 500 to 1,000 barrels of beer. Each barrel of beer is 31 gallons. At our production brewery, we'll produce 8 different beers, and we'll produce 45 to 5,000 barrels of beer. So a lot fewer beers, but a lot more of them.
Great. And just getting a lot of comments. Wonderful synergy / symbiosis with the farmer in the Fredericksburg area. Lovely to hear about that local relationship. Thank you so much for hosting, and good luck. Cheers. So just getting a lot of thank yous for that. But yeah, I know we're just getting close to the top of the hour. This was the most entertaining session of Homecoming 2020.
Hopefully next year we can all meet in person. You know, you guys come to the Loyalty Society, and man, we'll have some beers. It's a good time.
We would love that. Right Proper, as Thor mentioned, Right Proper is always our sponsor in our Loyalty Society area, bringing a fantastic experience to our Loyalty Society donors. So we hope many of you are able to join us in person the next time that is possible, hopefully next year. But we're so thrilled that all of you were able to join us here today. And we are especially grateful to you, Thor, and your team for letting us kind of visit with you today and come along for a tour.
Thank you so much, guys. So look us up online and email me with any questions. We'd love to continue the conversation. Thanks guys. All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.